This is a video version, or really more of an audio version, of an essay I posted to Medium. It's linked in the description. I figured I would make this because I know a lot of people prefer to listen to essays these days rather than actually read them. And I'm not hating. I get that. I like video essays too. Now, when I call this a defense of Skyrim, there's a reason there's so many parentheses around the word defense if you look at the text, because I don't mean to imply that the game's obvious and even not as obvious flaws, elaborated on meticulously by many a multi-hour video essay, hey Pat, do not exist or do not matter. They do exist and they very much do matter. I mean by it to explain why this game gets so much attention and scrutiny, enduringly so, despite its gaping flaws and distant release date far beyond what its apparent mediocrity, or if we're being uncharitable, fault, would normally merit. I mean, Ride to Hell is atrocious, but no one is still talking about it in 2024. Hell, the eternal joke that is Fallout the Frontier doesn't attract any continuing scorn. Like, nobody cares, even though it spawned directly from the Bethesda modding community. Although, to be fair, you don't have to pay for it, so it's less egregious, I guess. Now, I'm having a great deal of fun playing through Skyrim again, despite being vastly more aware of the game's shortcomings than ever before. Now, trying the game once again, unmodded, aside from what Bethesda added to the Special Edition, I find myself having, fun. Quite a bit of it, in fact. How? And more importantly, why? Because clearly, giving the enduring popularity of the game and how many people are still playing it and still talking about it, I'm not alone here. There has to be something drawing people to the game despite itself. Now, the natural first response would be to say it's the mods, and I'll concede that is a big part of it for a lot of people. But while I can only speak for myself, the fact remains I'm having fun without mods, even without mods. So, what gives here? Well, let me jump right to it. I believe Skyrim offers a unique experience. I mean that very literally, and not in the way that technically every game is unique because no two games are exactly identical. The closest analogs it has are Bethesda's other games, hence why Bethesda game is sort of its own genre, and of those, I guess you could argue Fallout 4 is the closest to it in design. However, because the setting and aesthetic are radically different, the experience is still substantially different if those are criteria you value highly, which I do, thus maintaining a distinction. Further, I don't wish to discuss Fallout 4 too much here, not because it would not be apt to do so, since if my memory serves me, it would, but because I have not yet finished my current Skyrim run, and I intend to replay Fallout 4 once I've done so, so I'm gonna come back to Fallout 4 once I have an up-to-date experience of it, since I've only played through it once, and it's been years since I did that. And that playthrough was modded. I've never played through unmodded Fallout 4. I intend this time to make it vanilla so as to judge it on its own merits, just like this Skyrim run, although what counts as vanilla Skyrim anymore has been hopelessly mired by the Anniversary Edition. For the record, I am playing the Special Edition because the Anniversary Edition looks to be nothing but a downgrade to the game, and I don't want to pay for it. Now, let's define terms here. What kind of game does Bethesda make exactly? The term Bethesda game really only becomes useful after Daggerfall, much to the dismay of OG Bethesda boomers still pining for a true sequel to Daggerfall, though ironically Starfield might actually be the closest they're going to get to that at this point. Be careful what you wish for and all that, owing to how different Morrowind was from it. But if I had to describe it in one phrase, it would be a first-person, open-world ARPG. None of those constituent descriptors are anything special, but the combination is, in fact, novel. Now, old school dungeon crawlers from the 90s were often first person, but that trend died out, right? I mean, the original ARPG, Diablo, retained the isometric camera of its CRPG contemporaries, as do many to this day. That is not to say there aren't first person RPGs, just that they're vastly outnumbered, right? System Shock 2, Prey, Deus Ex, Borderlands, The Outer Worlds, and of course Bethesda's own games are all first person. But there's vastly more that aren't. Now, the fact that Elder Scrolls games are first person is absolutely crucial to their appeal because of how the camera view contextualizes the game world. Elden Ring can look as pretty as it wants, okay? And holy fucking shit, does Elden Ring look drop dead gorgeous like almost the entire time you're playing it. But it will never be immersive. I will never feel like I am in the lands between because I am not looking at it through my own eyes or a digital stand-in for them. I am looking at it via a disembodied camera that follows my character, neatly centered in the view at all times, around. There is a reason the most effective horror games are first person. And don't fucking at me about my Silent Hill or my Resident Evil or my Fatal Frame or whatever other old third person Japanese horror game is supposedly the scariest ever. I don't believe you. I don't buy it. You have nostalgia goggles on. It's far easier and more effective to frighten the player when they feel as if they are the ones in danger, which a first person perspective enables by letting the player as close to literally step into the game world and look at it directly themselves. Likewise, if you want a player to, for lack of a better word, vibe with a setting, to feel as if they're actually there in the fictional world you've created, a first-person perspective is essential. The Elder Scrolls and Bethesda Fallout, but again, I'm not going to talk about that today, games being first person gives players the unique opportunity to experience a traditional fantasy setting firsthand. And I do have to specify traditional here, meaning yet another Tolkien derivative, because obviously there are others. Dishonored, for instance, is also a fantasy game, coming out the year after Skyrim, and it's also first person. But its setting is a gaslamp fantasy, and it's not an RPG. Yes, there's a progression system. No, I'm not fucking getting into the what is an RPG argument today. So, again, the Elder Scrolls stands distinct here. Of course, being first person is only necessary, not sufficient. This is why I believe Skyrim in particular stands out in terms of being immersive, because while its graphics and animation are decidedly dated, and were so even at the time it released, they're good enough to sell the world as believable. Whereas Oblivion just looks awful. I find it impossible to suspend my disbelief when looking at Oblivion. And I must concede, especially when looking far into the distance, where the draw distance and detail and geometry culling becomes blatant, or if I stare too long at the, character animations, Skyrim's illusion starts to falter for me as well. It may very well be that in another decade or even less, I won't be able to buy Skyrim as an immersive experience anymore due to my expectations for immersion advancing with the times, advancing with technology, and Skyrim's backwardness in comparison just won't be able to do it for me anymore. The same way that currently Oblivion and Morrowind don't. But as of writing this, it's not bad enough yet to shatter it for me. Not yet. Actually, I can't play through Skyrim without constantly taking screenshots, because as technically primitive as it may be, aesthetically the game is fucking gorgeous. The passage of time has not been able to neutralize that. Watching a moon, or both, rise over a mountain and peek through the trees in Falkreath, or watching the wind blow snow off the mountaintops towards the Sea of Ghosts on the North Shore while it's being lit by aurora, or even just the visual layout of the approach to the entrance to half the dungeons in this game gets me to, just stop and stare and hit F12 every time. The amount of work that went into making pretty much every spot on the map look as aesthetically pleasing as the engine and 7th gen consoles would allow was evidently astronomical. Probably even the priority, given that along with the music, the world layout and aesthetic are the most well executed part of the game. To see it all firsthand is something special. There is no other game in this sort of traditional fantasy setting you can view this way, in first person, with your own eyes, other than prior Elder Scrolls games. All of which, as I said, I consider too technically primitive to sell the experience. It is more than the visuals that sell the immersion, of course. Though I should emphasize the visuals are still critical to it, else I wouldn't exclude Morrowind and Oblivion from consideration here. The gameplay sells it too, specifically in how the player chooses and executes on a character build. Skyrim lacks character classes. Rather, you can spec into whatever you want. You have 18 skills to choose from. Granted, not all of them are useful, but we'll put that point aside. And these skills level up by being performed rather than an abstracted leveling system. You do still have a character level. You gain XP by leveling up skills, but it only allows you to spec into perks you have a high enough level in that skill to acquire. So essentially, you create a character build by practicing the skills it needs, and as you level those skills up and acquire perks in those skills, your character becomes good enough at that role to fully realize it. You don't become a master swordsman by picking the knight class in character creation in Skyrim. You find a sword, you use it to fight things, and as you do so, your skill with 1 or 2 handed weapons increases, increasing your proficiency with that sword, or a replacement sword that's better, and also unlocking more perks in that skill, further increasing your effectiveness with that kind of weapon. It's a more natural and therefore more immersive leveling system. It's less abstracted than traditional class systems. Even if I concede that you can still farm levels from skills you don't spec into to get perks for ones you do. But that's no worse than in any normal RPG where you can take the XP you gain from fighting and use it to somehow become a master hacker, even if you've never actually done that. The player picks a style of fighting they want to engage in and becomes better at it as they do it. So not only do you feel like you're really in Skyrim, owing to the camera perspective, but also because you can fight your way through it in the way you want to. And you become good at it in a natural feeling way. And again, you see it all happen from your own point of view. When you see your archery skill level up and flash on screen, it's because you just hit something with an arrow that you just shot from your bow from your perspective. Again, making you feel like you are in the game world. Furthermore, you're doing all this at a place and time of your choosing. Skyrim may rarely ever give you choices in the process of completing quests or even of just navigating dungeons, since basically all of them are entirely linear. But which quests you do, and when you do them, and which dungeons you run, and when, are up to you, because the map is open. The only barriers are the provincial border and the open ocean. You're not shunted from objective to objective, area to area. You go where you want, when you want, except when some quests, which again you do choose when and whether to do, teleport you around. The player may have little in the way of choice narratively or even just in incidental dialogue, but what you have maximal control over is where you go, when you go there, and how you overcome the obstacles that location presents to you. And I do want to emphasize again the choice you have in your character build, because people often seem to confuse Skyrim's character building being unbalanced with it not giving you choice. You absolutely have choice. In fact, you have a variety of choice in gameplay that few ARPGs can match, simply owing to their obsession with having you either mow down dozens of enemies per minute a la Diablo, or constantly forcing you to engage enemies in head-to-head duels like in Dark Souls. The fact that being a stealth archer is the easiest build to make overpowered doesn't invalidate other builds, it just means it's easier to build. Pretty naturally, really, it only requires you to spec into 2 skills to make it god tier. Well, I mean, Destruction and Illusion Wizards can also be made completely overpowered. You can see it on screen right here, as can Paladins, as can Necromancers. I mean, you can basically make any build you can think of into a demigod if you build it properly. It's just that some of them are easier to make so than others, right? If you're a Destruction Wizard, for instance, it's not a great primary attack skill unless you also spec into Alchemy and Enchanting, which when maxed out allow you to cast potion buff destruction magic for free. So it starts off underpowered, but eventually you become so powerful you can just fry every enemy you see with lightning storm and be fucking Zeus incarnate. Now people will harp on Bethesda for how player centric their games are, how the entire world seems to revolve around you in a very unnatural way. But I would argue that's only a problem from a writing perspective. In every other facet of Skyrim's design, the emphasis on the player, on their choices, where they want to go, what they want to see, how they want to fight, and what they're going to see and hear as they do so is a resoundingly good thing. Now, I will temper this with the concession that despite this, the game often refuses to tell the player how many of the game's mechanics actually work, thus potentially misleading or frustrating them. But it's not enough to ruin things, though were it any worse than it is, it very well might. Now, I realize that's very subjective, and I don't blame you if you disagree, for the same reason I don't blame anyone for dropping a FromSoft game an hour or two in because of how obtuse they insist on being. In both cases, I'm willing to forgive it because of how solid the core gameplay is, but I admit that's up to personal taste, though given the popularity of both, it appears I'm not alone in that. It's not the only subjective point of contention here, but that's inevitable. Notably, what I deem sufficient to make the experience immersive is also subjective. It comes down to one's personal threshold for suspension of disbelief. There's elements you can include that objectively make it more likely that more people will be able to do so, such as making the game first person. But it is no guarantee for any given player, right? If you find the game too gamey, too fantastic, too graphically limited to suspend your disbelief, then obviously my argument here isn't going to work for you and there's nothing to be done about that. Now, some are going to interject that my characterization of the core gameplay of Skyrim as solid is just flat out false, that the game's combat is jank and awful, insert pool noodle comparison here. I will agree it could be better. Now, unfortunately, first-person melee combat is always going to look less exciting than third-person, simply because most of your character's movement won't be seen because it's outside your field of view. That's not to say I'm going to argue it couldn't be better. There are ways to mitigate the problem, such as attaching the camera to your character's actual head so it moves and jerks as your character does while you're hacking away at enemies. There was an old camera mod that did that, actually, and I could see it giving people motion sickness, but when I used it, it certainly sold the idea you're violently attacking people much better than Skyrim's barely moving camera that feels as if your character's spine can't bend or something. And enemies also react inconsistently to being hit, especially by ranged attacks, which rarely ever elicit any animations from them. I'd say Dishonored has Skyrim beat on literally every count here. I'm not going to argue with that. But you also can't bash people in the face with a shield in Dishonored. Nor can you cave their heads in with an axe, or send them flying across the room by shooting an ice spike through their sternum. Granted, Bioshock's combat is even flashier than that, with many of the same abilities: fire, freeze, shock, invisibility, telekinesis, etc. But it's also not an RPG, nor is it open world, so it's not really a direct competitor here either. Skyrim's combat is visually less visceral and less impactful, sure, but it also has variety that those games that compete with it in the first-person space lack. Again, it's the combination of attributes that's unique about Skyrim, not any of them individually. Diablo-like ARPGs often have way flashier, more impressive spells to cast than Skyrim, but there's a distinct difference and a distinct disconnect felt when you're simply watching your character zap lightning all over the screen as you watch from on high versus the group of enemies in front of you all get zapped when you shoot chain lightning out of your own hands from your own point of view. Right? There's a difference between hitting a cloaking ability and then telling your character to move around an enemy and stab them in the back versus actually popping an invisibility spell and walking up to enemies yourself and staring them right in the face in person while they can't even tell you're there. The latter makes me feel like the cheekiest fucker on the planet, and the former doesn't because it's not immersive, because I'm not directly doing it and I'm not directly playing it out. The final point to tackle is what it is about the vanilla game, or specifically in this case a special edition, that made me want to play it when every attempt I've made to complete the game modded since my second completion run ended before level 50. This is important for me at least because, as I said, a lot of people come to Bethesda games specifically for the mods, and I used to as well. Yet here I'm having more fun without them. And truth be told, I don't even think it's the fact it's not modded that's making me have more fun. Because there's mods like the unofficial patches that do make the game objectively better than what Bethesda made because they remove all these sources of frustration and jank and bugs and glitches and all this crap that should have been fixed but wasn't, as well as graphical mods that stave off the game's increasing age with some engine wizardry, thereby prolonging how long I will find the game immersive. My not using them this time has more to do with wanting to get an unaltered experience, to judge the game on its own merits, rather than as a modding platform. Something I found difficult to do without a full vanilla playthrough, as it's been the better part of a decade since I last played Skyrim without any mods. What really made the difference was my mindset, was how I approached the game. I had gotten it into my head that all the dungeons and points of interest were bloat that made the game take too long to complete, and I was spending enough time as it was getting the game modded up before each playthrough. I tried playing the game like a more traditional RPG, following the quest markers, jumping around the map, knocking off quest after quest after quest, and that was a grievous mistake. I misunderstood what I was dealing with. The quests of Skyrim are not really the meat of the game, and thank fuck because they are awful. In fact, they're arguably the worst part of the game aside from its technical ineptitude. By focusing entirely on completing quests, only clearing locations the quest markers sent me to, I ended up burning myself out on the game in no time, because I was constantly engaging with the worst part of the game. And again, I'm willing to concede your mileage may vary here. The game flashes quest markers everywhere. Why wouldn't I follow them? Clearly the game thinks they're important. So if they're shit, then the game is also shit, since a major part of its design has failed. I can only say that I view the quest markers differently now, more as guides to direct my wanderlust. If a bunch of quest markers end up accumulating in one area of the map, I may direct myself to that area and clear it out. Or maybe there's one particular quest I want to do for its reward or something. So I go off in that marker's direction and find and clear and loot any locations I come across on my way there, thus making it not the entirety of the journey, but merely the capstone at the end. Incidentally, playing the game this way has also made it feel much more like an adventure, and I an adventurer, slowly coming to know Skyrim as I work my way through its nooks and crannies. Cope or not, it's totally changed my perception of the game from one that bored me with its tsunami of dogshit writing to one that keeps me engaged with its constant stream of adventuring, despite the dogshit writing. From one I couldn't get halfway through to one I can finish entirely. I would wager, as a matter of fact, that if I apply a similar change in mindset to Fallout 4, I might be able to happily finish that game as well, something I haven't done since the very first time I played it. Though to be fair, the quests and writing in Fallout 4 are even worse than Skyrim. So it remains to be seen if I'll actually be able to stand it long enough to finish the game. We'll see. That, in totality, is what Skyrim offers. An immersive, gorgeous for what it is, traditional fantasy world you can traverse at will, where you pick your own playstyle and evolve it naturally as you play. Other games do all of its elements better, except the environmental aesthetics, which I would argue are stellar given the technical constraints they were working under. But none of them contain all those elements together. That is why there is no substitute for Skyrim. There is no other game that offers what Skyrim can offer, and that, along with the mods, is why I would argue so many people, including me, are willing to put up with its innumerable technical, mechanical, and narrative faults, because regardless of that, it still competently executes on a unique experience you can't get anywhere else. And that makes it worth playing. And it does execute, as I've said. This is not like Paradox games, which are such technical and mechanical disasters that I can't stand playing them, although trust me, I've really, really tried to like them. Even if the experience they purport to offer is unique, because they don't actually offer it, they only promise to. Granted, those games have a large dedicated fan base as well, so either their tolerance for jank and bullshit is higher than mine, or they're even more wedded to mods. It's also what makes me sad about the current state of Bethesda, because it seems they can no longer execute on this vision anymore. I could probably stand Starfield if the writing was as shit as Skyrim, but the game world, or I guess the universe in this case, was just as engaging to explore and fight my way through as Skyrim. But it isn't, which is why I haven't bothered buying it. It doesn't look to be worth my money, and that doesn't bode well for the Elder Scrolls 6, since Bethesda have now struck out twice in a row. And that's a great disappointment to me because I find Skyrim so appealing, and I do so wish that there was a refined, more balanced, more visceral, even prettier, modern Elder Scrolls game to replace it with. But Bethesda evidently lacks the talent to create a game like that anymore, which is ironic because it's largely the same people in charge, even this many years later, which is unusual. And since no one else seems interested in creating this kind of game, Skyrim looks destined to remain a unicorn of sorts, a one-off kind of game that will, as I already said, increasingly lose its impact as it ages and looks increasingly archaic, eroding the immersive experience I so prize it for. Granted, I realize this is a personal problem for many. I suspect nostalgia and mods, among other things, will keep people wedded to it for a long time. But for me, I suspect its appeal has an expiration date, although I can't exactly tell you when that will be. But when that date comes, if no one has made a replacement, I will lose this unique gaming experience to the passage of time. And that will be a damned shame, because it was good fun while it lasted.